If you're a person who isn't terminally online like me, you might not even be aware of a recently released game called Stellar Blade, or if you are, you might not have thought much of it, or maybe that it looked neat from trailers on social media or during Sony press conferences. Stellar Blade is a new character action game from Shift Up, where you play as a character named Eve. You fight alongside a ragtag team against the Natiba as you try to reclaim a fallen Earth, gathering upgrades, helping people out, and listening to chill tunes. This is a video game-ass video game, unashamedly so. Somehow, this very basic character action game has become a lightning rod for a slew of fabricated controversies, mostly revolving around how the main character is a sexy, exaggerated fantasy, and somehow that, being from a Korean game studio, equates to a stand against modern, woke, SJW, and diversity movements in games. Like I said at the beginning, terminally online. But as I've been playing Stellar Blade, I've been struck by one thing more than anything else. For a game that was hyped up as being a bastion of heterosexual horniness, a haven and a wasteland of modern games turning gaming heroines into real people instead of sex dolls, this game is surprisingly sexless. So this is going to be a video about how Stellar Blade isn't sexy enough. On the edges of the recent DEI and Gamergate 2 controversies, a contingent of nerds made this game their entire personality solely because Eve falls into a pre-approved mold of sexual attraction they formed based on a non-stop diet of porn and anime. They began to hype up Stellar Blade as something it wasn't. They compared her to action heroines like 2B, Bayonetta, Rain, and others, hyping Stellar Blade as a return to classic character action games that was more prominent on the PlayStation 2 and PlayStation 3. And I want to say I've always been on board with that possibility. The aforementioned games and that era of gaming hold a very special place in my heart. I've lost count of how many times I've played all the way through Bayonetta, Devil May Cry 3, 4, and 5, and Ninja Gaiden 2. I've never hated on Stellar Blade because of a sexualized character design. However, I was hesitant because, even playing the demo, Eve seemed to have very little in the way of personality. And the attractiveness of a character goes beyond just being scantily clad or suggestively dressed. It includes their attitude. The problem with Stellar Blade is that it is a stylish character action game, but it's a game whose characters have very little character or style, and as a result, even what sexuality there is falls flat. And I want to deconstruct that a bit because of how Stellar Blade sits at a fascinating intersection between culture war and cultural celebration, being hyped as what a section of gamers wanted it to be, rather than what it actually was. To be blunt, Stellar Blade isn't sexy enough, not because it doesn't show enough skin, but because aside from showing skin, the characters have very little going on to be endeared to. As a result, Eve as a character can't hold a candle to other action game contemporaries like 2B and certainly not Bayonetta, and her forced status as a sex symbol comes off as hollow and desperate in a way I'm sure the developers never intended. Let me get the good stuff out of the way first. I want to be clear that I think Stellar Blade's art design overall is phenomenal. The enemy designs vary from Stranger Things Demogorgon knockoffs to some really damn cool boss designs. The world is full of post-apocalyptic cyberpunk influences that give players plenty to gawk at throughout, even if a few too many environments come down to being an overgrown sewer or one of the multiple drab deserts you spend hours going through. The later environments get more interesting visually, but it sucks you spend 15 hours going through rarely stimulating generic post-apocalypse standard locales and solving very basic LEGO Star Wars puzzles in between combat encounters. It kind of reminds me of Darksiders in that way, where you're telling me about this cool, expansive world with all this lore apparently, but that cool shit must be happening elsewhere because I'm looking in the sewers for Natiba for hours. Speaking of Natiba, the main plotline is painfully threadbare, at least for the first 3 quarters or so, before the ending ramps up into a series of epic climaxes that throw terminology and lore at you that you probably haven't been paying much attention to because it started blending into an anime mush hours before that point. The most interesting and climactic moments aren't given any real build-up, and most of the gameplay is focused solely on the action while the story feels like set dressing that just gets in the way of a main course. The lack of investment in the story feels like a side effect of the boring characters, which I'll get to in a minute, but also sparse storytelling, which can see you going sometimes hours with very little in the way of plot development. Much of the game is simply a quest to find a series of MacGuffins and eliminate enemies, with the true intentions behind your mission shrouded in mysteries that are incredibly easy to see coming a mile away, so that when the twists do arrive, they land with a thud. And I don't want to hear, well, it's a character action game, they don't have good stories, because that's BS. Plenty of games have memorable stories and characters like Devil May Cry 3 and Nier Automata. In essence, the game's cutscenes become an annoyance you have to go through to get to the meat of the game, which is actually really good. So before I start nitpicking, I want to say that the gameplay is generally really solid. There's an engaging loop of exploration, spotty platforming, and generally crunchy and acrobatic combat that follows the standard format of a Souls-like with various camps you reload with upon death, though without losing and needing to recover experience upon death. The gameplay loop itself was a bit surprising because I figured as a return to older hack-and-slash games it might be more linear, but it's actually all a connected world. In fact, one thing I noticed playing is that this game is basically in the exact same mold as Respawn's Jedi Fallen Order games. The platforming, the way collectibles are placed and unlocked, the basic combat and staggering system, parrying, dodging, upgrades, relying on one weapon that you evolve usage of over the course of the game, and even a little robot friend that scans things in the environment for you.
He copied my whole fucking flow! Word for word, bar for bar!
That being said, it's not a bad thing by any stretch, and I like those games. My first video essay was actually on how Fallen Order blends Eastern and Western influences into something compelling and new, so go check out that video, it needs some views. I want to say Stellar Blade is good, and at times even a great game. While the overall story fell flat for me, the world is interesting enough that I'd be interested in seeing what a sequel could present, and the gameplay is flashy and fun, even if I would always like to see more in the way of weapon variety in my character action games. I even like the over-the-top anime climaxes because even if Stellar Blade felt like just a collage of influences with very little original thought, it was clearly made with love for its influences like Bayonetta, Nier, Dark Souls, and more. This is a work of passionate and talented developers, and it's fine that it didn't land for me in some ways, because I don't think good art needs to be for everybody. I want to say all of this up front, I think Stellar Blade is good, and I liked playing it. But this video isn't about the story or gameplay. It's how this game has been forced into a role in an ongoing culture war. And that brings me to Eve. The biggest problem with Eve Stellar Blade is that she is, at her core, despite all the surface level sexiness, an incredibly boring character. The most style she has comes in the variety of unlockable costumes that run a vaguely fetishized gamut from pretty cool cyberpunk ensembles to more gothic fashion and skin-tight bodysuits with accompanying jiggle physics that leave little to the imagination. As a very sex-positive person myself, these outfits on their own don't give me pause. If a game wants a sexy lady, whatever. It's the fact that Eve has been poised as an anti-woke sex symbol, despite having nothing to her character even as a sex symbol. Eve stands on the shoulders of some of the most iconic and sexy gaming heroines of all time, queens with pomp, verve, edge, grit, ladies who serve death in high heels and low-cut dresses with a wink and a one-liner, whose larger-than-life personalities manage to outshine their fantastical, larger-than-life assets. Instead of following in their path, however, Eve languishes in the shadows of her own bountiful assets. These outfits and boob physics have become the primary selling point for a legion of gamers who have posed Stellar Blade as some kind of victory against wokeness in games. But you may be asking, how is a sexy lady in a game a victory against wokeness? Now, I've tried explaining this controversy to people in person, and when I told my woke leftist friends in person about how Eve was positioned as a stand against wokeness because she has a big old caboose and knockers, they couldn't understand how that equated to being anti-woke. Loads of people on the left love tig-ol' biddies and a girl boss protagonist, and they always have, even in gaming. Stellar Blade has caused some interesting revisionist history here, where if you bring up games like Bayonetta or Nier Automata to say, hey, I'm woke and I like sexy women in games, you'll probably be met with the idea that progressive gamers only liked those games after they came out. They weren't on board since day one, in fact, hated them at first. Their evidence for this is usually a string of random opinion pieces, asides in interviews, or Anita Sarkeesian talking about Bayonetta. Let's not let all of the actual game critic reviews at the time get in the way of the arguments that they're fabricating here. I recommend you go watch my friend Savvy Writes Books' deep dive essay into Gamergate because she does a wonderful job summarizing everything about Anita, including the Bayonetta controversy. See, Anita thought Bayo was an oversexed porn fantasy, and being a progressive voice at the time, that somehow became the narrative we're seeing from Stellar Blade fans, that the entire gaming establishment, all the woke devs and journalists and fans, felt the same way. This isn't true, and I'll let Savvy's points here speak.
Every aspect of Bayonetta's existence, from the way the camera is magnetically drawn to her sexualized body parts to the pole dance reward for completing the game, is expertly designed to be sexually affirming and satisfying for a presumed straight male audience.
A lot of this criticism relies on the willful ignorance of the LGBTQ community. Games like Bayonetta, in my experience, have been pretty popular with lesbians. Games like Fallout New Vegas, which Anita also critiques, are extremely popular in trans circles. When Anita treats all game audiences as if they're the presumed straight male character, as she often says, I think that's short-sighted, and it ignores a lot of the communities that are really engaging with these games. In some cases, the player is a woman, a part of the LGBTQ community, or both, and the game serves an entirely different purpose. Some women have huge boobs and they jiggle. I find it more of an unrealistic body standard to show the boobs not jiggling. As someone who was cursed with a lifetime of big boobs until I got my surgery, I legitimately did feel empowered by seeing large-chested women displaying their big tits for the world while doing badass shit, because I'd spent my entire life having the Catholic-informed culture around me telling me to cover it up and to hide myself.
Anita was a pop feminist a decade ago, and while she didn't deserve the harassment she received, she also wasn't right about everything, and her criticism was often overly simple. I have not ever agreed with her take on Bayonetta, for example, yet if I criticize Eve, for some reason people assume I fall into this camp. This is despite me being an old head when it comes to sexy action games. I was playing Onechambara on the Xbox 360 when the kids signing Stellar Blade petitions were still learning to start their own Minecraft servers. I was platinuming Senran Kagura games when they were getting mad about not having a date for high school homecoming. While I've certainly cooled on the genre as I've grown older, I still love a good action game no matter how sexy the protagonist. Except for Senran Kagura, it feels weird playing games with near-naked 16-year-olds when you're not actually 16 anymore. Otherwise, put a vampire in there, a bondage witch, a twink cyborg in high heels, whatever, I'm down for it. So Eve's sex appeal doesn't faze me, it's rather the opposite, that her lack of appeal bores me, and shows how desperate this crowd of gamers has become for any perceived win, even an entirely hollow one. One of the big failings of this current Gamergate 2 movement has been assuming how people feel about things, like assuming because you criticize Eve, the sexy lady on the game box, you're against sexiness in games, you want to yuck everybody's yum, you want to take away the sexy ladies. This has a lot to do with the current conversation around DEI initiatives, where a few consulting firms have been accused of ruining games with wokeness through making characters more realistic and less like pornified sex fantasies. That's a whole separate issue, and you should watch these essays I did on wokeness and the people who criticize it in media for some good primers on how the people leading these conversations are usually just in it for the grift, to get a following or to make money from. But the entire reason Stellar Blade has been fabricated into a controversial title boils down to this. Eve is a beautiful, traditionally attractive woman and is easily objectified, and a contingent of gamers want to see that more in games, compared to female characters that aren't perfect supermodels, have diverse body types, and are generally more realistic representations of women in real life. However, this isn't a zero-sum equation. The reality is that these different kinds of representation are aiming for entirely different things, and there is room for both in the modern market for games and art. You can find plenty of sexy ladies in games, by the way. Fighting games like Street Fighter, DOA, and Soul Calibur, aforementioned games like Onechambara and Senran Kagura, plenty of indie and low-budget hack-and-slash games with scantily clad anime protagonists, and then of course the myriad of porn games that you can get for free on itch and Steam. These are all games that have continued to exist with very little controversy. You can get all your sexy lady fix easier than ever in video games, so why did one sexy lady in Stellar Blade become such a sticking point? The problem is that the people trying to position Stellar Blade as an anti-woke rallying cry aren't interested in exploring those possibilities, they just want to make false equivalencies. I'm going to try and explain this using a comparison I've seen many fans make defending Stellar Blade, because there have been a lot of people who have criticized Eve's sexiness as being unnecessary and not contributing anything, and fans take that criticism as a kind of criticism of sex appeal that appeals to them specifically, instead of critique of Eve as being bland, and will try to turn the argument around, usually presenting one of a few things as counterexamples, namely the sex scene in The Last of Us 2 and sex scenes in Baldur's Gate 3. So, for example, if someone were to say, I think it's weird how obsessed people are with this character's tits, because it's been the only thing Stellar Blade fans seem to care about, those fans might defensively retort, what about the bear scene in Baldur's Gate 3 or the sex scene in Last of Us 2? I have no skin in the game, so to speak, with Last of Us. I don't think either are very good games or stories, but it's a bit different to have just a sex scene used to show a relationship between characters than it is to have a scantily clad anime woman, isn't it? I mean, the point of Last of Us 2's scene isn't to titillate, it's not even suggestive material like Eve's outfits, and it certainly didn't draw the same fawning, open-mouthed adoration that Stellar Blade's defenders rallied around the game with. It just happens. It shows two people engaging in consensual adult relations as a way to release tension, and the story moves on. The same can be said of Baldur's Gate's myriad sex scenes with its selection of varied party mates. You get to know these characters, navigating their favor and romancing them for hours at camps between stretches of gameplay. And if you navigate a relationship correctly, you get a brief sex scene. They can be titillating, sure, but that titillation isn't incessant in the way Stellar Blade attempts to be. It's a culmination of a relationship, a climax, for lack of a better term, to a specific story arc that can vary greatly in each playthrough. But both of these examples get at something deeper about Eve as a character. These sex scenes feature characters that are fully fleshed out. In the case of Baldur's Gate, you spend sometimes dozens of hours traveling and getting to know these characters before you get to this point. They show sex as an extension of human connection and relationships. If you want to know why so many people make so much thirsty fan art over Baldur's Gate 3 characters, it's not just because you can seduce them in the game, but because each party member is a fully realized character with their own style, humor, behaviors, and stories that endear them more to the viewer. So the point of the sex scenes aren't just a titillating reward, but represent the culmination of a relationship. It's not just the nudity that makes these characters sexy, but the way people engage with them and their personalities. Much like relationships in real life, players will develop their own preferences and be attracted to different party members over others, pursuing or spurning advances based on what they like for their character. It's part of the role-playing fantasy. Whereas the sexuality of Stellar Blade is simply Eve walking around in skimpy outfits. It's not adults conversing, getting to know one another, and consensually engaging. Instead, it's a 13-year-old fantasy idea of what sex is. Hot lady, dress sexy, boob jiggle, and that's enough to get the job done, I guess. And that's as sexy as the game gets. Despite comparisons to Bayonetta, Eve doesn't have anywhere near the scandalous camera work or winking to the camera. It feels like Stellar Blade refusing to commit to the bit in a way. Like if it had just gone all the way and had close-up angles and goofy nods to the camera, it would have been far easier to agree with its sexualization of the main character as a legitimate selling point for people interested in that. It would have been understandable that it engaged a fervor of people defending it prematurely as a sexy game because the sex appeal would have been more than incidental, more than a sideshow that had been foisted to the game's main selling point. Yet, forget the solid gameplay and great art design and the world and characters that the developers worked years to make. The skimpy outfits of Stellar Blade were the rallying cry for some gamers. This bizarre investment in Eve's scantily cladness is evidenced by the petition to uncensor the game, where one costume out of over 40 unlockable costumes was slightly edited to cover slightly more cleavage. And as I've mentioned, these skimpy costumes are all the sex you get in this game. The camera is pulled out in combat, a wise gameplay choice that makes it hard to even see the boob jiggle. The game doesn't have sex scenes, or unlockable sexy pictures of Eve, or suggestive dances, or even destructible outfits. All of this chest beating and online rallying for this game is a silver bullet of sex appeal, and in the end it's just tits and skin-tight costumes. Stellar Blade might have jiggle physics, but it's not a sexy game. Because unlike something like Bayonetta or even Baldur's Gate 3, Eve as a character is boring. No matter what clothes she's wearing, Eve is a wet towel of a character. Nearly every emotional beat is reacted with the same empty stare. Even as she fights monsters to the death, she barely musters a grimace. I don't want to spoil anything because the game is still new, but late in the game she gets a series of earth-shattering revelations and just kinda barely reacts? It's not helped by the British monotone of her voice actress, but it's not like she emotes much outside of her lines as it is. She has almost no observations of her own that don't exist solely to give players a gameplay hint. She has no quippy remarks. She doesn't pop off a sick one-liner when she eviscerates that boss that's been giving you trouble. Compared to her contemporaries, she has absolutely no attitude. She barely has a personality with what you could call defining characteristics. She's not overly curious. She's not overly emotional. She's not competitive or tenacious or even really that determined. She just kind of goes with whatever flow is presented, taking developments in stride. Compare this to another fairly stoic protagonist in Nier Automata's 2B, where 2B starts the story as reserved, eventually things happen that draw more emotion from her. Lots of things. I won't spoil if you haven't played it, but long story short, 2B has a lot of emotions and is clearly affected by the things that happen to her in 9S. And despite being reserved, she even has time for one-liners occasionally. She's not as explicit as Bayonetta, but she's still a badass. Comparatively, Eve starts similarly reserved after a tragic opening scene, but her emotional range never shifts from blankness. 2B's story should be a template for Eve to follow, but she doesn't ever break through any emotional barrier, even as the game attempts to reach an emotional climax. Even as she begins pontificating about salvation and the meaning of blah blah, her voice never reaches above a dull baseline. At first, I thought the game was portraying her as despondent due to a trauma reaction at the beginning of the game, but that's just her personality, for lack of a better term. Her lack of emotion feels less like an intentional storytelling device than it does a half measure to make her a voiceless protagonist like Gordon Freeman or something, except she does have a voice, she just doesn't use it to say anything interesting. Even the various NPCs you can help with side quests get a greater range of emotion than Eve. I don't know if it was an attempt to make her a quiet, stoic badass like every kid who tried to act like Cloud Strife in middle school, but it comes off that same way, boring and mildly annoying. Her and the crew she works with are all fairly bland, but even Lily has a somewhat peppy personality and has hints of a more tragic backstory that forms a slightly more compelling character. Yet Lily is a problem on her own because she looks like a child with boob physics. And some people are going to say she doesn't look like a child, except this game has a child character to compare her to, so be the judge as you compare this child and apparently non-child. I'm not saying she's not an adult, I'm saying it's weird how much she looks like the kid. But speaking of B-side characters, Eve is outshined by nearly every other female character in the game. Like these cyberpunk Valkyrie-looking sentinels, look at her, she's serving, she's giving anime Angel of Death concept art realness. Or Taki, the stern partner of Eve's who dies in the intro. She's on the screen for like 5 minutes and she gets more attitude than Eve gets for 20 hours. Taki absolutely should have been the main character, and if Stellar Blade 2 happens, I hope it's a prequel focusing on her. While I'm on the subject of female characters, it's worth bringing up that for all the phenomenal style the game has, it's all reserved for the highly sexy women characters. Like, even the disabled jazz singer Android has a side quest that ends in her getting big robo-titties. That's all well and good if that's the creator's vision, but part of what makes that vision so bland compared to other contemporaries is an unwillingness to extend that same style to the men. Exhibit A is Adam, who fights with Eve, get it, to save Zion. Compared to Eve and Lily's more stylized faces, Adam looks like any number of generic Call of Duty tactical soldiers. He is almost photorealistic, which is an odd choice next to the Alita lookalikes in the game. Like most other male characters, he's also continually covered to his neck in this tactical puffy jacket look, even in this arid desert settlement. Which isn't a problem, but it is literally something almost every male-presenting character has. They have barely any skin showing, if any at all. This is such a missed opportunity. I'm not talking about needing the men to show all the same skin as women do, but this blanket approach to design doesn't allow characters to stand out like they should, and a studio capable of some great art design shouldn't be missing a chance to do that anywhere they can. All of these issues get at a core of Stellar Blade's lack of sexiness, a lack of style, not in the world design obviously, but in the characters themselves. For all her backflips and sword lunges when compared to contemporaries, Eve just does not serve, and it has very little to do with raw sex appeal. Look at some of the other games that wear sex appeal on their sleeve. You've got Onechambara, where zombie-slaying ninjas spin chainsaws in bikinis. You might not like it, but it's a campy premise that justifies the sexiness of its heroines, while also allowing them to show personality and their unique weaponry and attitudes. Then of course there's Bayonetta. Perhaps the most insulting thing about comparing Eve or Bayonetta is that Bayonetta is everything Eve is not. Putting aside her sex appeal for a second, she is emotive, talkative, witty, with a comeback on hand, has ridiculous one-liners, is a total reality-bending badass. Look at this shit. This is how one of the Bayonetta games opens. This is what stylish action is all about, style and action. Her design is even suited to her personality, with intentional choices meant to convey her intelligence and maturity, like wearing glasses and high heels. And all of that is part of her character before you insert her sex appeal. Bayonetta owns her own sex appeal, and while titillating, it's an essential part of the character, who she is and how she navigates the world on her own terms. By comparison, Eve's sexiness seems accidental. Surrounded by this sexless world and realized only through random assorted outfits, Eve seems less like a confident, self-assured badass main character than a generic sword lady who keeps accidentally falling through a stripper's wardrobe. Even as you get to the most interesting story bits and Eve attempts to come into her own as the hero, none of it lands. Maybe it's because the game holds so much of the most interesting narrative moments for the last few hours, leaving you to slog for more than 10 with this blank slate, but the result is still a boring character that I didn't care about by the time the credits rolled. Which I find to be a fascinating development. As petitions like the one for censorship have shown, The vocal contingent of Stellar Blade fans seems to only prioritize this thin, juvenile sex appeal. They don't seem to register that Eve as a character could have been so much more, and if she had been, she could have been so much more sexy. Like they don't see the difference in sex as conveying a relationship and connection in Baldur's Gate or The Last of Us, they don't seem to see Eve as anything more than a canvas for their most vanilla carnal desires, a conventionally attractive husk to watch jiggle her way through a piece of art so many developers and artists meticulously crafted as an experience. And they're so affixed on simple character design to notice the rest of the game, or at least what it could be. Stellar Blade is a good fun time with an engaging gameplay loop that is let down by poor characterization and bland storytelling. It's a video game-ass video game, and most people will enjoy it as such, but I'm going to remember it as an example of how transgressive movements will rally behind anything to prove their point, no matter how poorly it stands up to scrutiny. Stellar Blade simply isn't the game these people propped it up to be, and it never was. A sexy main character doesn't mean a game is some kind of anti-woke statement. The developers wanted to merely make a cool experience that recalled games that had influenced them over the years. For better or worse, they succeeded and created a fun game that I hope can be improved on with a sequel. But the tragedy is, I don't think many of the people who are calling themselves fans of this game realize how their short-sighted focus on jiggle physics blinded them to the rest of this experience. Also, they can claim some kind of victory in an ideological battle they seem to be waging against nobody but themselves. Hello everybody, and thank you for watching this very latest video essay of mine. I don't do a lot of media analysis lately, and I'd like to get back to doing more, but I'm hoping because this does cross over with some of the more political issues in the gaming industry we've streamed about recently, that this can still get at least a couple views that justify the 2 or 3 weeks that I've put into it at this point. While Stellar Blade came out when I was still putting the finishing touches on the Satanic Temple video essay, I have been working a lot on this game, and it's just really taken this long because the game is so long, and I've been doing a lot of other things. I have a lot of different projects in the works right now. So, if you enjoyed this video, please be sure to go check out some of the links down below. I do this all as a full-time job, and need to still make ends meet and stuff. Thank you very much. Please share, like, comment, do all the fun things. Check out the Patreon links if you'd like to be listed alongside other amazing producers here. And I hope you have a wonderful day, and thank you very much for watching.